Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching The Naturalist Capitalist. I am your host, Reed Coverdale, and we've got something a little different going on today. He's an English teacher of over 30 years. He was my English teacher in high school for 3 years. He's been the biggest influence on my philosophy in general, and he's also my dad, Tom Coverdale. How's it going, Dad?
Going well, Reed. It's good to see you.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Recognize this room, maybe?
Oh yeah, I'd like to say they're all positive memories, but it wouldn't necessarily be true. So,
Gotcha.
Yeah, why don't you just tell us about your history of teaching and how you've seen teaching change over the years, and how you've seen the reception of students change over the years.
Okay, so I started teaching in 1987, and quite literally, so that's 34 years. It's all been in rural New Hampshire. So I used to teach at a regional school that borrowed students, brought in students from 6 different towns, and I currently teach in a single town school, rural New Hampshire. So in 1987, I started with literally chalkboards, mimeograph machines, personal computers. I think they were, so they certainly didn't exist. The internet, I don't think Al Gore had invented it yet. I forget, but it was very, very different than what it is now. So just those technical aspects, I guess, of the profession are just a reflection of really how the students have changed too, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, so 34, obviously, a lot of my audience probably wasn't even alive at that time, and so it's hard to really explain, I guess, in meaningful terms how kids have changed. I can make some statements, but they don't have a lot of meaning just based on my statements, because it's all relative to something. For example, students don't think as much anymore. Well, no, they just think very differently, and they think about different things. They process information so differently. Back in 1987, we were still, I would say, pretty much a text-based culture. I mean, well, I don't know if that's really true, but it was much more textually based, if you understand. So people didn't have iPhones, people didn't have personal computers. So now I would say we're much more obviously screen based. And so the way that students not only processed information, but more importantly, received information is just it's a totally different dynamic than it is now in 2021. So as an English teacher, I have really 4 or 5 primary responsibilities to the state and the community. And those are based on skills. I need to teach composition. I need to teach grammar, which of course is related to composition, vocabulary. I teach literature, and I teach speaking. So those are the primary components for which I'm responsible. And of course, all of those are absolutely altered and swayed by just what I would consider an absolutely overwhelming overhaul of the means, the vehicle, and also the content of communication. So to say how the kids have changed, I guess it would say it's a reflection of how culture has changed. And so my job as a purveyor of communication, or what I would say high quality communication in that culture, naturally has to change, because it's all a fluid movement. And what I expect of my students now is is so different than what I expected from my students 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And on some level, it's a no-brainer. It should be different. I mean, if you're, if I'm a teacher and I teach old school English, well, that says something, because communication is not, it's not a means by which you communicate sometime in the past. It's alive too. So, rules of grammar and the canon of literature, all these things that supposedly are so strong and so important, especially back in the 80s and the 90s, well, that's all fluid now. And so there's so many ways to say things have changed, and to say that students are, quote, dumber now or less tolerant of what I would call enduring writing, or the idea of resilience in thought. Well, I don't know. That's the whole idea of communication. You got to change with the time. And so the thought processes, the way you generate all of that is so different as well.
Yeah, and you're not even just talking about, different styles of literature or different interests in past writings. The actual laws of grammar have changed, right? I mean, I remember the big thing was the unassumed gender used to be his or him or he, and now it's there. So, that's just a change that you've had to go through. So what I really liked about your class, and I think what everyone in the school likes about your class, is you weren't about teaching the rules or the structure or the I don't know, just the foundation of how things worked. You looked at that as just a necessary step to be able to get to the point of communicating and interesting the reader of whatever you're writing, or capturing the audience of whomever you're speaking to. So you were teaching people how to think and how to be persuasive and how to engage their audience, where other teachers were teaching you how to lay out a paragraph and have an introductory sentence and your 3 supporting sentences and then your conclusion sentence. And that was what mattered, where I think you really transcended that, unlike the other teachers.
Well, thank you, Reed. I appreciate that as a teacher, and also as a dad, of course. I often describe English, or the rules of English, in terms of music. So a really good musician knows the rules so that he can break them. For example, jazz, right? I mean, so if you know the rules and you understand how to improvise, you can finally jam. And that's the point, is now you can communicate through your instrument, and in a way that someone who doesn't know the rules cannot. If you're tied to the score, and if you're tied to the chord chart, well, you can't communicate. You're just kind of juggling with what you have to do. And so that's the way that rules, in my estimation, especially in communication. Yeah, sometimes it depends on your audience. If you're writing an AP exam, you want to pay attention to the rules and kind of flex when you can. I can show a little bit of procatalepsis here, where you start with an indirect or the dependent clause. So there are all kinds of rules. Just it's for an effect, but the effect is what matters, right? If you write a powerful piece and your audience is weeping with pathos, I mean, I don't go and start analyzing the structure of the grammar. No, I look at the audience and man, you did it. That's great. I don't care if you wrote with fragments. If they're crying because they're so moved, the rules, what are the rules for? The rules are for causing an effect. And what you said about, trying to get my students to think, I think a good teacher learns from his students. Whenever it becomes teaching, becomes one way, I'm become some sort of dispenser of information. You know what I'm saying? Like something where I'm just a vehicle of information. Something is flawed, it's got to be a two-way street. And so, you know, the part of the challenge to get my students to think was a bit selfish because I wanted to think. I, you know, would you like to come to a classroom full of 20 students who are just absolutely bored out of their minds? I mean, yeah, you've probably been on the receiving end of that, and frankly, I have too. But what's worse than that is to try to teach those 20 kids, and it's deplorable. So engagement, mental engagement, not only inspires the student, it keeps me from a day of drudgery. And you know, if when I first started teaching, I thought I'll probably give this 5 years, but what it's turned into is an invigorating look at why I think the way that I do. And it's not static. It shouldn't be, and it's dynamic. And so not only are my students, do I expect my students to change, but I think they should be able to expect that I'm going to change. What else? Anything less is something different than I think teaching. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah, I mean, aside from the shop class teacher flying off the handle and freaking out at some girl or something, your class was the only one where I witnessed people being moved to tears. You know, and you know, I'm a huge critic of the Department of Education, and a ton of people would never guess that my dad is a high school public English teacher. But you know, I remember in the school, so many of the teachers were tied to rubrics and just one size fits all approaches to grading students. And you were one of the few teachers who could see the potential in somebody that didn't lie in the rubric. You could tell if somebody would be better at writing an essay or if someone would be better at writing a poem. And it seems like you would try to cue into that and try to bring the best out in people. But the structure of the school, and as I've learned since then, it's just the overall structure of the Department of Education almost seems to discourage that. It wants people to be judged on one blanket standard, and if you don't make that standard, you're a failure. And most teachers seem to buy into that, and I'd say you and just a couple others really tried to find the individual value in what each student was good at. Would you say that's accurate? My my critique of that overall approach that schooling has, and is that what you tried to do? Just try to find where someone was good at something that the test might have failed them for?
Well, not only would someone who well, let me just say this. I am a teacher who is highly critical of the National Education Association. I've never been a member of the union. It's really just opposed to everything that I think makes invigorating teaching on a national level, at least. I certainly don't have any qualms with a local union. You know, I mean, these are people I know and understand. But I've never been a member of my local union because 2/3 of my dues would go to the national level.
Right.
You know, I was 1995 New Hampshire Teacher of the Year, so was whisked to Washington D.C. to, you know, I guess praise the nature of American education, and I didn't really have a lot to say about the greatness of American education. And a lot of it is exactly what you were talking about. It's the institution. You know, the difficulty is, here's the problem. Standards are tricky because as you know, I'm conservative. I'm coming from things that are very conservative manner. English teachers aren't typically conservative.
Right.
Usually we're way weird, liberal, left, whatever you want to call it. And not only am I conservative, I'm more conservative than most. And so maybe what I'm about to say about standards kind of reflects that. I think if you don't have standards, then you really don't know where to aim.
Mhm.
This goes back to the whole idea of rules. Rules are to be broken, but you need rules. If I decide to play a guitar in a band with, obviously with other people, and I say, bullets to the rules, it's going to be messy. No one's going to want, I'm going to bring cacophony to the group, right? Now,
Right.
if I'm off playing in the woods by myself, knock myself out. I can do anything I want without rules. But if I decide to be within a society, or in this case, a band or something, you gotta have rules. Man, you can't play a B flat when everyone else is playing an E. It's just not going to work. And so the same is true even in standards, say in writing, right? I can have stream of consciousness and write everything kind of in an abstraction that hopefully my reader will experience some sort of epiphany and get what I'm saying, I guess. But I am not that guy. I want to know the rules so I know how to communicate clearly. Then I can break them on to a purpose, right? The same is true, I think, of standards. If I say, well, whatever people learn in my class is based on what I think is important. That's in some ways attractive, right? Because of course I know what is important. But if this person goes to another place and, I don't know, tries to write for someone else in college, a professor, for example, I really do him a disservice if I say, it doesn't really matter if you write according to this rule or that rule, just kind of express yourself. Well,
Right.
unfortunately, that student is, I think, going to be headed toward, a pretty dismal end in that class. And so institutions, they do provide for cultural norms. And I think cultural norms are important when you're living with others, and so it's it's a difficult thing. It's when the cultural norms or the standards of the institution become more important than the individual. And it's the words of Jesus when he said, when the Pharisees were so upset that his disciples were breaking the rules on the Sabbath, and he would be known to heal people on the Sabbath, which, of course, according to Judaic law, you couldn't do any work, even if it was healing someone. And so, Jesus' rejoinder to them is, look, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And I think that's what happens is institutions have to survive because deviation equals failure and failure is destruction. So if any individual steps out of line, that means the institution falls. That is an institution that is damaging. But in order to understand how I am going to relate to others within a community, I think standards are important. You know what I'm saying? I hope
Yeah.
that makes sense. What I teach needs to be transferable to another situation. This is like good science. I did this. Hey, I got cold fission going in my sink. Oh yeah, let me see that. So it has to be something, an experiment that is reproducible in another place for it to be, to have veracity. And so if I hope that makes sense.
No,
Standards, I think standards are important in in context, but the context is not in order to keep the institution propped up. It's because so the individual can actually be free to live fully within the context of the environment that he's in. And part of that living fully and living free is being fit to live with. And so that's part of that. Okay, I'm in a society, I've got to learn how to communicate, I've got to learn how to fit into this subculture, and now I can express myself. So standards, and you know this, I tend to be a teacher who's I when a student gets an essay back, it's full of marks,
right.
run on, frag.
Yeah.
It's full of all these things. You can't do this, you can't do that. It's full of rules, and so I do want to bring students to a standard where they understand stuff. Then they can pick what they want to break and what they don't want to break. And that is an individual who's equipped to live a fulfilling life, because no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to do it on purpose. But when he doesn't know that, he's a loose cannon, or not a loose cannon necessarily. He just doesn't know any better. And in terms of education, he's not educated, right? So
Right.
I've used this example before. I don't, I've worked a couple of summers construction, and I don't correct the grammar of the guys on site, because when I'm in that context, that doesn't matter, right?
Right.
And if I did correct them, I should get an S-wing to the temple, and I should become part of the fill for the wall footer, right? But in other contexts, that grammar is important. So standards, I think, are important, but it's based on a context, not in order to prop up the institution.
No, I think you're 100% right. And, that might be surprising to hear from an anarcho-capitalist libertarian guy. But I actually think that, being an anarchist or a libertarian requires a more educated, more responsible populace. When I was setting polls at my last job, you had to understand how things work in order to do that safely. And once you understand how to do it safely and how it works, then the rules and regulations become stupid because they're extra and they just slow you down and you know what you're doing. If you have no idea what you're doing, then those rules and regulations are 100% necessary, because otherwise you'd be putting the power out, you'd be killing your groundmen, you'd be doing all sorts of things. So I think you're 100% right that understanding how things work sets you free and actually make the rules kind of irrelevant, or laws at least, not necessarily the rules. The rules to how things work will always remain, but the laws kind of become irrelevant. And I think that, go ahead.
That's the dirty underbelly of institution, is one size fits all.
Right.
You need to use this safety feature whenever you do XYZ, even if it doesn't make sense.
Right.
That's right. That's kind of the sorry, I don't have anything against the military, but that's the military mindset. This is okay, let's look up the protocol and this is what happens, blah blah blah. But it doesn't fit this situation. Well, you still do it. Well, that's an institution gone amok, and that's what I'm saying, is that's a standard that is not, it doesn't, it's a one size fits all mentality that just doesn't work. Gun control in rural New Hampshire should not be the same as in downtown Trenton, New Jersey. It just doesn't make sense. And so when institutions, i.e., e.g. governments, make these federal rules, and I think this is something that we concur on, to say blanket the whole country with some sort of standard. Okay, it may make sense in the DC, beltway, but man, it doesn't fit in Croydon, New Hampshire.
Right.
And it never should be that way, and anyway, so I think we both agree with that.
Yeah, and on the note of understanding how things work so that you are set free, doing what I do, I meet so many just, economically illiterate people, and I'm no scholar in economics, but, I meet people who just straight up deny the existence of inflation, which to me is just insane. I don't know how you can deny it, just looking at the prices of goods throughout history and just studying basic economics. But they just straight up deny it exists. And the ability to have a coherent conversation dies right there. And I know you used to teach philosophy a while ago, and you just stopped because nobody cared about having a consistent worldview. You could disprove their worldview and it wouldn't bother them. They'd say, yeah, oh well. And that seems to be a progressive theme, not politically progressive, although it does bleed into that too. I just mean like it's a growing theme, that it doesn't matter what I think as long as I think it and it makes me happy. Who cares if it actually lines up and makes sense? When was there any point in time where you first started seeing that to really become prevalent, or was it just a slow evolution, or what are your thoughts on that?
Right. That's it. Yeah. So part of the problem, and I touched a little bit with how teaching is different. I think I don't want to get too kind of weird and philosophical on you, but there's a different way of looking at truth with words, textual words, written words versus spoken words. So when students become less familiar or less adept at reading text and responding to text, everything instead is conversational. I think this is one of the marked differences between a video culture or a screen culture and a text culture. So what happened I taught philosophy through literature, and it was an applied class. In other words, we would read a book, say we would read, we read Siddhartha, let's say, or we'd read parts of the Divine Comedy, or so we would read and try to get what the author was saying. And then it would be a discussion on how to apply that, or what we thought of the application of that concept. When we would read the Communist Manifesto, for example, or Thoreau, we would be able to look at the words and really have a discussion about what they meant. That's the primary thing that I would teach my philosophy students. They would say, okay, murder is bad. All right, define your terms. First of all, what is murder? What is it? Is it just killing someone? What if the person's coming into your house? Is that murder? What if you have an army uniform on? Is that murder? You see what I'm saying? A police uniform, is that murder? Let's really define what your terms are. And now let's define what bad means. And so their first assignment in my philosophy class was to defend whether or not murder was bad, which you would think, what? A conservative wondering if murder? No, I'm asking them to define their terms.
Right.
That is lost, I think, in a screen culture. And it's not just, part of it is just, it's so fast, right? Well, we're not talking about those words, what you said yesterday. We're talking about what you said right now, and not only right now, I mean, not even an hour ago, just right now. So there's no contemplative text base. Let's really discuss this. So I think that's part of the problem, where a student in a syllogistic statement will make this statement and then make this statement and this statement, and I'll say, hold it, that third statement doesn't connect to the first statement. You broke this. It doesn't make sense. And so the student either wouldn't comprehend it, I don't understand what you mean, Mr. Coverdale, or, oh, it doesn't really matter that much to me because this is what I feel like. And I don't, and I'm not trying to say it's because that kid didn't read books anymore, but that idea of textually based discussion, it's more, and this is from my conservative background, that's more of an absolutist perspective. You really can't, Plato talks about this. It's his ideas, right? The idea, imagination is one of the, I can think of chair, all right? So you have an idea of a chair and I have an idea of a chair, but they're probably not very close at all.
Right.
Because you may be talking about, a shaker chair and I may be talking about a lazy boy chair. So just thinking about things is not accurate. That's not really close to truth. If I write them down or I describe them, that's getting closer. Mathematically, if I start to define it with mathematics concept, now we're getting very close, right? Does that make sense? And our culture has just moved away from that. and we're all kind of in that imaginative idea. And so because of that, the way that we discuss important ideas about truth are all in flux too, I think. And I'm frustrated, but I'm also 57 years old. And I think that idea of, it's time for me to move on is, and I'm not saying I'm done with these kids, they're rotten. No, it's just I look at things differently, and I can't I think it's my voice is important to my students. I think this is going to sound really arrogant, but I think they respect my perspective and they want to hear it, because I think they believe that I live according to my principles, that I won't say something. Of course, I'm hypocritical. By the way, I hated high school, so I graduated early, as you know, and I went traveling in a 66 VW microbus. So while my class graduated, I didn't care anything about high school. But I think they believe, and I hope they believe, that what I say is important. But at the same time, I really do have difficulty seeing things from their perspectives. And it's not their fault. It's not my fault. It's just I'm an old dude. And so when that first started happening, dang, Reed, I haven't taught philosophy Evan was in my last class. So I don't know, what's that, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe. And it's just, I have a lot of students who want to take that class because they think it's kind of sitting around and, if I taught the class again, it would be a lot less reading and a lot more discussion, so.
Yeah, I mean, regardless of whether or not anyone believes in absolute truth anymore, they don't even believe in relative truth anymore.
Oh, no, right. You're
just
right.
like zero standard. There's no consistency at all. It's just absolutely whatever goes. And I think, I think that this might sound a little conspiratorial, but I think the powers that be actually appreciate the muddying of the waters, because then it's a lot easier for them to get their agendas passed. It's a lot harder to criticize anything if you don't even have relative truth anymore. It's very hard to stand on any principles and criticize anything that's happening anymore. It's all about the moment and all about.
It's all in flux. This is my teacher's copy of Brave New World. It's kind of messed up, but I mean, it's all written through. I teach a novel like Brave New World, and it was first written crazily in 1930. I mean, it's a long 30. I forget the year, but 32, I think. Crazy long time ago. But Huxley was on to something. It was just an inundation of trivia, of unimportant information, and there's so much that the individual has to sift through it, and eventually just gives up, and I think about it. As I grew up, there were 3 networks: ABC, NBC, and CBS, and PBS was for the old folks, and that was it. Think of how many channels there are now, and so it's just because of the inundation of information, and who doesn't want more information? That's a great thing. Give everyone as much information as you can give them. That's great. Well, the downside is everything is relative, because no one, we can talk about this philosophically, even though you grew up in the same house as your brothers, had the same sort of situation, your truth is not their truth. And you multiply that times 1,000, and there you have it. This is my experience, and how dare you have anything to say about it? I may listen to what you have to say, but it doesn't make any sense because it's a totally different experience. There is, and so here comes my conservative past again. That's why I think in order to have reasonable discussion, there has to be a supra truth, not super truth, supra, above. It's got to be something that makes everything fit. It's the same thing about an orchestra. If you're going to have a society that is not just absolute cacophony, you got to have a score. You got to have somebody just orchestrating it. Otherwise, it's noise, and maybe it's pretty where I'm sitting, but I don't know. It's
Yeah.
it's a mess.
And we agree on that. We could get into a whole different discussion about how we arrive there, but we do agree on that principle that you do need some sort of anchor, some
Right.
sort of absolute truth that you're clinging to in order to rectify everything else. Otherwise, nothing you have to say is worth anything. I wanted to talk about a few books, though. You already brought up Huxley, Brave New World. A lot of people reference these books and they've never read them. Like, I don't, so many blue collar people I know who have never read 1984. They're always talking about how we're headed for an Orwellian dystopian future. But I thought it would be useful to lay out the differences between what Huxley envisioned and what Orwell envisioned. So could you just give us a condensed vision of what Huxley thought and then what Orwell thought? And then after that, we'll talk about what we see actually happening around us.
Okay, and so this is my spin. Now, I've taught both these books for, I don't know, 20 years, 15, 20 years, a long time, longer than, I don't know the right date, but so, and this is condensed, so very condensed. Right. The concept is both novelists believe that the government was out to control its populace, and there could be, in some ways, Huxley's model shows a little bit more of a benign, or a benevolent, I should say, a benevolent government. In other words, the reason they moved to the places they did was because they wanted people to be in peace and harmony, kind of idea. Yet they still were coercive in determining that outcome. Orwell, on the other hand, the government was much more malignant. It was evil. It was kind of it was out for true power. I don't know how to say that other than, I'll just leave it that way. So one way to look at it is Orwell's government, Big Brother, by the way. Big Brother is, well, this is debated. Big Brother probably doesn't even exist. It was the, so there was, I don't know how to say this. The enemy in 1984 is it's continually contrived. And so Big Brother was really an organization that always kept tabs on all the citizens to be sure that all these citizens are always doing whatever they want to do, always having these students do what the institution, want them to do. If the citizens stepped out of line, it was punishment. So it was control through coercion in 1984. And so, you think about that, does that work? Well, yeah, it does work on one level, because if I don't do what the government says, I'm going to experience pain for it. And so that's really, I think, when Orwell wrote 1984 in 1950, I think he was looking at it, and he was looking at it in a Soviet idea that if you didn't do what we want, if you don't do what we want you to, you're going to be sent to the gulags, and so it was punitive, right? Huxley, on the other hand, says he writes a novel where the government controls you by pleasure, not by coercion. So the government gives you what you want. And because of that, I don't know, I guess you would call that positive reinforcement. You learn to do what the government wants you to do so that you get what you want, not in Orwell's sense, kept from what you want. All right. So those are the differences. The things, and I would say, I tell my students today, 1984 seems to be more like a North Korea. right? Where you step out of line. I mean, there are other governments too, but that they really see that, right? At least our spin on it, versus a Western government that is really giving us what we want through, COVID paybacks, or,
Right.
the idea of, well, if we'll give you this enticement. This is what you, and so, okay, I don't care what you do as long as I get whatever it is that I want. And so that's much more the Huxleyan idea. There are some other components in Huxley's novel that, well, there are components in both of them. Sorry, I'm being so kind of disjointed here.
No, it's
Uh,
good.
in Huxley's novel, there are a couple of other things. One is, he has a genetic caste system. So it's understood that the resources can only be enjoyed by an elite group. So in Brave New World, what's happened is they have genetically modified a certain caste system, so the alphas can enjoy unbridled pleasure at using all the Earth's resources. Betas have been chemically and embryonically altered a little bit, so they're not quite capable of what an alpha is as far as appreciation. And you go alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon. And epsilon is the lowest order, and they are absolutely content with working 8 hours a day in a 4x4 cubicle without windows, and because they've been genetically modified to have no ability to have pleasure beyond that, if that makes sense. So that takes care of all the nasty duties that no one else wants to do. Whereas on an alpha level, all you do is you have jobs, but they're nominal jobs. They're sinecures, and you just go around enjoying things, having pleasure. So that's one big component of Brave New World that, until about, I don't know when the human genome was unraveled, but it wasn't that long ago. Really didn't seem to really jive, but now of course it does. The other thing that Brave New World has is soma. And soma is a drug, I'll call it, that is encouraged. The government encourages use of it when any sort of dissonance occurs. If I come to some sort of difficult decision, I'm stressed out, I take soma. Soma has no addictive qualities, except maybe the idea of a relief of stress. No hangovers. It's a drug that's been developed that has all the benefits of any sort of stimulant, narcotic, without any of the detriments. So actually the lower caste systems are paid in soma. So, that's all they want. Just give me my dose of soma and I'm happy. I'll do whatever you want to do. And so that's kind of the structure of Brave New World. And that's how it fits quite a bit. The 1984, what you hear people saying a lot, the Big Brother is watching you. It's not necessarily that the government is so punitive, but Orwell uses technology as a means by which the government is keeping control over its populace. So in every resident, you cannot escape telescreens. So every residence has a telescreen, and it's kind of like a two-way mirror. You're not really sure if you're being watched. It's kind of like your phone, right? Or the camera that I'm looking at now. I mean, you hear about this, right? That someone could be watching you, or they have the opportunity to. Well, in 1984, you cannot escape the telescreens unless you go out into the country or something like that. So that's why you hear people say, oh, that's Orwellian. It's because the government is monitoring you. It's not so much that they're out to punish you. I hope that makes sense. So, and yeah, that's true. I mean, I don't think how many people are tracked down because of a camera in a parking lot. I mean, we are being videoed, a lot more than we believe. That's why people reference that. Frankly, I think Huxley's control by pleasure seems to be a lot more of what we're experiencing in the West, frankly. You know, with the technology thrown in, maybe 1984's technology. So I don't know if that makes sense. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah. I think we're living in a mix of both.
Yeah,
What I think,
absolutely.
what I think they really do is they create a boogeyman that no amount of force is unjustified against. So whether it's terrorism, you know, the war on terrorism, we got to fight terrorism at all costs, or what happened in New York City is going to happen again. So we need to tap your phone lines, we need to see your search histories, we need to support this giant military, um, you know, strategy throughout the Middle East. That's one great example. Another one, I think, with the coronavirus, you know, I think that anyone who opposed locking down or opposed government mandates was demonized as someone who didn't care about people who were dying, or, you know, was calling it a hoax. You're seeing a lot of people get deplatformed who criticize Israel or criticize, you know, I mean, just name the sacred cow. If they criticize it, they get deplatformed, and there's no uprise against it because the public in general has accepted that those boogeymen are evil, and if you do anything to question what's happening against people who support that boogeyman, then you are supporting the boogeyman yourself. So I think that's very intelligent. It's a good strategy, because if you are just Orwellian, people are not going to take it. I mean, people are already getting sick of the lockdowns, like Texas and Arizona and another state just lifted the restrictions this week. I'm sure that's going to happen in secession. You know, I'm sure all the red states will do it, and then the blue states probably. Like, people just won't take it after long enough. But if you can apply the right mixture of
Right.
giving people what they want while also just completely destroying whatever you can successfully make the people oppose, you're doing a good job. I mean, the most like dystopian thing I saw was that stimulus bill that they passed a week before Christmas, seeing people like jumping for joy that they were getting $600 for, you know, that they could spend on Christmas, when most people who were getting that check, they paid way more than that in income tax. And a lot of them were like locked down inside their houses, lost their jobs. And the vast majority of that money was funding things that nobody would approve of. But they were jumping for joy that the government was giving them something they wanted. So you have like this really incestuous mix of Orwellian and Huxleyan dystopia coming together. Would you agree?
Yeah. So, Orwell, what you were talking about, you know, the conjured enemy. I think I said Big Brother was an invention of the state. No, that's not true. Goldstein is the enemy
Right.
in 1984, and whether or not he exists is up for debate. It probably doesn't. And so you're right. INSOC, um, which is newspeak for English socialism, INSOC, is probably conjures this enemy of Goldstein, right? And also the Brotherhood, which is it's a group of people who are out to subvert, you know, order in Oceania. So you're absolutely right. That's Orwellian. The idea is we need to have a boogeyman. And in 1984, there's the 2 minutes of hate, where, because you're right, it is kind of a mix of both of them, because the populace has no passion, because they're doing their automaton-like job. They don't do anything. The government recognizes that they need some sort of passion, right? It's just part of the human experience. You got to have passion. And if you're always doing this really mundane job, it's going to fall apart. So they do have a 2 minutes of hate, where they broadcast a view of Goldstein, the enemy of the state, and people, you know, just yell at the image. And there is that fear that we have to bind together to overcome this enemy. And in doing that, that gives us incentive to do the meaningless, mindless task that we've been given. And without the enemy, why are we doing this?
Right.
Who is the enemy? It's the guy telling me to do this. So I'm not going to do that anymore. But if the enemy is someone else, you're right. I really see that. And then, the $600 soma would be Huxley, right? And so it seems to be kind of emerging there of both of them. You've got to create a boogeyman, and then you also have to give people what they want. Now, I think these are really, I think you and I differ in some ways in that the reason I'm hesitating here is, I'm going to go ahead and say it. I'm not convinced that we are at the place where our government is at a, like an INSOC yet. I don't think the true power of our culture, of our society, is in Washington, D.C. I think it's somewhere, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I think they're the ones that legislate, and they're the ones that make laws, but people run them, if you know.
Oh, yeah.
So
sure. Yeah.
that's, I don't, they do make there are powerful things in play globally, I would say. And I'm not one of these, I'm not the Trilateral Commission, or, I'm not way into those conspiracies. I just think that our politicians are kind of frontmen. There's something
Oh, yeah.
big. And, certainly the president, I mean, we all think, oh, if we get the right president in the place, everything's going to be all set. I think that's bull. But I'm not, I hope that makes sense. I don't think our government is out to get us, not yet. But, I think, when I say not yet, I think these things are kind of being practiced, fine tuning maybe. And this old guy probably won't be around by the time it becomes a Huxleyan reality or an Orwellian reality. But I think we're moved along. It's amazing. For example, in education, I've been telling my students that I don't think their children. So these are 18-year-olds. I don't think that their children will have an English teacher teaching their upperclassmen.
Yeah.
I think it'll be Grammarly. Actually, there won't be need for the rules, because the rules will be, it's kind of like a matrix thing. You'll just be programmed, or you'll just write and it'll change it for you. You know what I'm saying? I mean, and Grammarly is pretty good. I mean, nuance and irony and those kinds of things are still a little bit beyond Grammarly, but I think for the most part, guys like me aren't going to be around pretty soon. It's not going to be needed. So I think that's the English example. I think that COVID, these kinds of things, and again, I'm not a conspiratist, but boy, has that promoted that. That's moved it right along, right? And now, oh wow, we can work from home. Sheesh. And so it just becomes much more digitized. Everything is, the more digitized things become, whether it's our work, whether it's our shopping, whether it's our education, the more digitized it becomes, the more vulnerable I think the population is. I noticed there was this deep fake just put out by, I don't know, it was on someone, I forgot, and the fans of the star could not tell. You know what I'm saying? I mean, those things are happening. And so I think these lines are being put down, and whether or not something's going to be, I think we're in the process of one of these governmental, I don't know if government's going to be it, but someone's going to be able to control, through a mixture of Huxleyan and Orwellian ideas. And here's the scary part. It's inevitable.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
It's going to happen. It is going to happen. It's a little bit like driverless cars. I'm not for that. I think that's one more thing that is being taken from us, I guess, quote unquote, that lets us be zombie-like and disengage in our environment. But when statistics say that 93% of accidents are because of human error, it will be a moral issue, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You turn it into morality. You can't have a driver driving a car. It's immoral. It is a moral thing that the computer should run the car because it's, you see what I'm saying?
Oh yeah.
It's just, that's the impetus, and so that's what's going to do it. And it's just going to we're just going to digitize. It's really interesting. Huxley thought, and this, he wrote his, remember, at 1930. And so then after World War II occurred, he kind of revisited it. He wrote a foreword to a later edition and said, okay, well, I may not have gotten it all down correctly. He thought that it was going to be nuclear power.
Mhm.
He thought that was going to be what, because of course, nuclear bombs in World War II. And so he thought that it was going to be some sort of nuclear thing that ushered in this new age. I think technology, that's my opinion. I think just our tech-laden culture is what's doing it, which brings up another book, Fahrenheit 451.
Yeah.
Which is, that goes along a little bit more of, an English teacher take on the lack of literacy in a culture, makes that culture so susceptible to manipulation. Hitler's book burnings and those things. Why were they burning books? Because he wanted the minds, right? And in Fahrenheit 451, Bradbury, and this is way before, this is kind of a prescient. It was amazing that he came up with this, that people had TVs the size of their walls. He called them parlor walls. And they were just absolutely absorbed by what was going on. And they could even interact with the television. This is written back when televisions were this big and they were black and white.
Right.
And he talked about this parlor walls, and it's kind of that idea of, he wrote about a time, a futuristic time when books would be banned. And kind of the Huxleyan idea is, well, you know what? Maybe you can create a culture where you won't have to ban them.
Yeah.
Because no one will read them. They're irrelevant. And if I ask my student, would you rather watch a movie or read a book? What do you think? And to be honest, not to be a hypocrite, I would have said the same thing back when I was in high school. All right,
Yeah.
part of it's just teenage laziness, if you know what I'm saying. But Fahrenheit 451, there's a lot. I don't really like Bradbury as a writer. I don't like his style, but man, just nailed it as far as this culture. We're just give me my parlor wall. That's all I want. Mildred is the wife of the protagonist, and Montag, and Mildred is just absolutely absorbed by what's going on her media, in the media, and that's all that matters. And you think about it. I mean, how this rules. It rules. And any gathering, look around, and in time, where are people? They'll be in the group of people, but they're on the phone. And to say that, Big Brother, is this Big Brother? Is this 1980, or excuse me, is this Fahrenheit 451? Is this Huxley? It's all of them.
Yes. Yeah.
And the thing that's similar about all those cultures is that the population is absolutely manipulated. Absolutely manipulated. And that's kind of how I see it in my classroom is, you kids, my students, are products. It's not a willful thing. It's not that kids are always lazy. They've always been lazy, but it's a ushered laziness. Don't have downtime. Fill everything, fill every moment of your day with some sort of stimulation.
Yeah.
And if you have that, then it's going to be hard to distinguish what is significant and what isn't. And then once everything's the same, it's all kind of static. Now we can begin to manipulate because you don't have the ability to perceive what is significant and what isn't, because it's all the same. It's all deep fake, it's all fake news. It's all the same. And so that's when you start to move it along for where you want to. So I think all the lines are in place for conspiracy type governments to exist. And I don't know.
I wanted to comment on, the difference between the state or corporations or powerful people controlling things. I think those lines are getting blurrier and blurrier, so like, is YouTube really a private company when it's selling your information to the government? It's giving all your search history results and every website you've been to. Is Google actually private at that point? Or when they're deplatforming people who oppose the general agenda of the state, like, there's a reason if you criticize Israel a lot and you're a high profile person, you get removed from YouTube. Or if you, if you're an extremely stalwart critic of the warfare state, or freeing people like Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, then your search results it's harder for people to find you. Your algorithms are screwed with to make it harder for you to have more visibility. So that's not just by chance. There is a partnership there, and I think people really need to realize that, that it's there's a lot of resistance that needs to take place. I think what's dangerous is that the role that government plays is justifying anything that happens. So if a corporation is doing something really bad, it's a lot easier for the people to criticize it, right? Because it's its own selfish entity or whatever. So you can boycott it or say you really disapprove of what's happening. But if it gets passed into law by the government, then it has the sanctity of democracy approving it, and then it's really hard to resist. So that's kind of where we are. We've got this really incestuous relationship between government and corporations that have really, as you said, they've flooded the market of information instead of really trying to burn books. I mean, they have, like, as I just pointed to, they have deplatformed some people, but you can still find the information if you want. You can still research what's going on in Yemen, what's going on in Palestine. Like, all those things are available, but nobody cares. So you only have to take out the high profile people who are really agitating. You deplatform them, but you don't need this massive campaign to suppress all the other information, because people are more interested that, I don't know, Donald Trump ate pizza with a fork, or Cardi B made a really crazy song, or whatever. That takes precedence over what's actually happening.
Right. And a part of the danger too is the population cares more what kind of underwear the president wears than the policies he's making. And it's because they have been nurtured on a diet of trivial stuff. And I think you're really right. The whole idea of Facebook or Twitter, that's the man behind the curtain. You really see those, they really have the power. Sorry about the pun here. They trump the powers that be by giving them access to the masses. Right. And so, because everyone's here, everyone's hooked. In Fahrenheit 451, the government uses the media, or I will say the medium of the television, to track down the culprits, right? And they dictate, okay, everyone, you need to go out of your house and look down the street and find the one person who is running down the street, 5, 4, 3, and they count it down, and everyone opens up their front door, and that's how they track Montag, and
Right.
you're exactly right. And it's through the guise of morality. This is why we have to, deplatform this person, as you put it. It's because he's immoral, you
Yeah.
know, and that's why. And now we're into this cancel culture where, anyone says anything that might be construed, you know what I'm saying? So it's not based on some sort of reasonable discussionable type of concept. It's just whimsy of the populace. And um, so it's, I don't know, there are a lot of these novels are touching different parts of it. And I think, yeah, you're right. We're headed that way. And the scary part, and sometimes some of my students get wigged out on this. There's nothing you can do.
Right.
Um, and when you and as you said, if you start to storm against it, just deplatform you.
Yeah.
And what are you gonna, you can go out and storm around in your backwoods, but fine. It's really interesting. The main character in Brave New World is a guy named John, who has been raised on an Indian reservation, and I don't know what the word is I'm supposed to use. That's the way he uses the indigenous reservation, I think is what's being used now. And anyway, he is being raised outside of the Brave New World,
Right.
and he is I don't want to go through the whole plot, but anyway, he comes as a visitor to the Brave New World, and he is reasonable. He's been taught how to read, but and reads classic literature. And I think this is some of Huxley's statement here, but he really is a thinker, and he finds himself in this world, this society of non-thinkers. And he's novel. People are really intrigued by him because he's a savage, right? He's actually called John the Savage, and that idea that he would be someone who has none of the pleasantries of Brave New World, but he says these amazing things. He's a figure of intrigue, and what happens is Huxley has him kind of conflict with a guy named Mustafa Mond, who is a controller. So he's one of the people responsible for manipulating, right, the government of the Brave New World.
Yeah.
And John the Savage, has this long conversation with Mustafa Mond as to why would you want a population that is mindless? What pleasure would you have in that if they don't know how to think, that they don't know how to reason, that they're not living lives? And I think I said this earlier. The government of Brave New World is more interested in keeping things going. Just kind of let's keep the system that we have in place, and let's not tinker too much with it, because then something might go awry. And Mustafa Mond says, well, that's not doing a service for your people. And I'm sorry, John the Savage says that. And Mustafa Mond says, well, we started to try to give people what they want, but all we had was friction. We had conflict. We haven't had, crime in decades. We haven't had war. Everyone's at peace. Everyone's happy. What government wouldn't want that? And this is chapter 17 of Brave New World. And John the Savage makes this really powerful point. It's the messy things that are valuable. It's the things that have conflict, that cause me conflict, that cause me to change. It's the difficult parts that I experience, Tom Coverdale experiences, that actually brings about the transformation, that what we were saying earlier, that makes me fit to live with. Otherwise, I'm just kind of a thing, right? And it sharpens my ability to reason. It's conflict that does that. It's rare that a person changes on his own. He has to be buffeted and so when the government takes all of that away, you have a unit instead of a person.
Yeah.
And it's just so powerfully put. And so if you're going to read one chapter of Brave New World tonight, read chapter 17. It's just so powerful. And I think that's what you were talking about really at the beginning of this, where at the beginning of this video, where people living fully, they're aware of the rules and they choose willingly, rather than being herded into a certain way of thinking or a certain choice. And really, that's a strong society. It's made up of individuals who are thinking.
Right.
It's also a risky one, but it's the risk, and it's the danger, it's the difficulty that actually changes us, right? And I personally, I don't want change. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't want difficulty, right? I make things so it comes out easily, but I have to understand in changing my character, I do need to do things the hard way. And all of these books, the government is interested in providing ease and comfort to its citizenry to move them into this place where it's just existence. It's not anything beyond that. All right. You can tell I'm an English teacher. I ramble, don't I?
Yeah, well, no, it's good. It's all good stuff. I would recommend all three of those books, Brave New World, 1984, and Fahrenheit 451. I actually did read all of each of those books.
Right on.
As you know, most of the books you assigned, I probably spark noted, but those are three that I actually did read, and I would recommend them to everyone. I just wanted to close out by bringing this up. I kind of demonize a lot of institutions that you brought us up in, and you would demonize them as well in your own speech. And I describe what an idiot I was in early high school and middle school. I was kind of just like a really hardcore religious conservative guy. But every time I talk about that, I try to point out that that was not enforced by you and Mom, that you guys had standards for us. And, we had to go to church on Sunday, had to go to a prayer meeting, had to, read the Bible, whatever. But whenever it came to criticisms or wonderings about anything, you would always sit down and talk with us, no matter how crazy the question was. If it was something about murder or sex, it didn't matter. Like, you would sit down and have that conversation. Both of you guys would. And the other thing is, you taught us to be independent, both in thought and in action. There were, even though we weren't allowed to watch certain types of movies when we were growing up, you would let us, when I was 16, I'd go out for 3 days in the woods, 100 miles from home, to climb 6 mountains with friends. And other parents would be horrified at that thought, that you would trust us to do that. I just really want to make it clear to everyone who watches that the household I grew up in, there were standards that we had to meet and things we had to do, but independence in thought and in action was encouraged. And I just want your comment on that. Why because you were brought up similarly, like your parents were very strict on standards, but they also would let you do crazy things that other parents wouldn't let. And I don't think they were quite as susceptible. They weren't quite as willing to talk about as many questions with you as you were with me. But it's no wonder that I ended up where I am now, like with the thought process I have growing up with you guys and being in your class, listening to the criticisms you had of institutions. A lot of people might think it's weird that my parents were Christian conservatives, but if they actually saw how things went, I don't think that it would be weird. So I just want your comment on that, and then we'll close.
Well, that whole religious, being a Christian, it's the difference between religion and faith. And that difference, frankly, makes all the difference. If you are a reader of the Bible, I read the Bible, I'm going to say daily. It's not necessarily, it's pretty close to daily. That's what Jesus railed against. It wasn't the Romans, it was the church.
Right.
It was the church that the church is the ones that put him to death. I mean, so, and that's something that's missed by a lot of people. So the idea of, I've explained it this way, having a kid is like building a house. And what you do is you put systems in place. Let's say an electrical system. You wire the house, right? And as you build a house and you put in a circuitry, of course you're going to put in a circuitry that makes sense to you as a parent.
Right.
This makes sense. I think this would be a three-way switch, and this is where the 220 comes in, because I think this is where the washer or the dryer is going to be, and so this is how the circuit's going to be built. And why? Because when my son leaves, I want him to have something to live in. I want him to have a house, and he is going to live in his own house. And you know what? He may he may do different circuits. Absolutely. I mean, that's what living on your own is. You decide, well, I don't want this room here. I want, I don't want the washer dryer here. I need to put the circuit somewhere else. But to raise a child and say, oh, I want you to make your own decisions. I'm not going to electrify your house,
Right.
or put circuits in it. I'm not going to do that. You're going to do that. You're going to be. I think you do a disservice. So it's kind of like my students in the class to say, well, you know what? I think all that matters is that you express yourself. We don't need to do these laborious essays. I don't need to teach you any sort of structure. I don't need to make up your own words. We don't need to learn these vocabulary words. I do them a disservice, because the world is not built around you. You have to live in the world that you're given. And
Yeah.
it's that whole message. So if I raise a kid and, in just, there you go. And I hear parents, well, my children, I'm not going to let them, I'm going to let them make up their own decisions. Okay. And I do too. I want to build a house, and you can move out of it if you want to, and I think that's what you're kind of expressing, is you went into a different neighborhood, and that's what it's supposed to be about. Yes, I have powerfully core, I just have powerful core beliefs about supernaturalism, and God, and a relationship but it's all about relationship. So I don't know if that answers your question. That's the difference. It's the same thing with the institution. It's that going back to that, man was Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Religion is meant to be left. It's the rules.
Yeah.
Sometimes you got to move to where you're jamming. You're living a life of faith. If you're always just memorizing the rules and never get beyond memorizing the Bible or condemning people, or I don't know, whatever it is that you do, you're not living a life of faith. It's a faith is what you don't know. It's not about what you do know. And so, it's the same thing. I think that's what gives credibility to what you call anarchy, right? Or it's I look at that as chaos. No, what you're saying is there's a certain maturity that says you don't have to have this umbrella over you all the time saying, nope, yep, nope, 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 yeah, you gotta do that. No, nope, 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 nope. I get it. Now just let me live. And, that's an anarchy that I would support, but I don't see it. I don't, unfortunately, I see a lot of kids, unfortunately, who their houses need to be wired, if you know what I'm saying. And we're talking about two different things, though, really. I'm talking about teenagers. You're talking about a population. So that was an unfair similarity, but or comparison. So anyway, I don't know if that answers that comment. if I had 5 more kids, I would do things a little bit differently, maybe, but certainly starting off, I don't know, 1994, May 2nd, I would start pretty much the same way, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think that was a great discussion, and we'll have to do another one sometime. But thanks for coming on, Dad.
Oh
And
man, it's fun. This is
yeah,
this is great. I love it.
yeah, we'll do it again for sure.
Okay.